There are very few case studies on HR strategy, and certainly the best one I know of is the story about Toyota, which started in life as a business back in 1937. And most of the slides that you're going to see in this presentation come from a book called 50 Years in Motion, written by one of the founding family members of the Toyota family, who says really what the basis for their success all stems from. All companies face competition, and if the competition is beating you, then it's an obvious thing to do to try and copy what they're doing so you can catch up with them. Now that's what Toyota did back in 1937 when it first started the business. It copied what Ford and General Motors were doing in America. It actually went over to America to see what they were doing. It wasn't too many years before they realised they were then ahead of Ford and General Motors in their production systems. Now, one writer who's famous for his theories on competitive strategy is Michael Porter. And Michael Porter back in 1980 made the very important point that if you are going to copy one of your competitors or copy anybody, then you have to copy everything. You cannot just copy certain parts of what they do. You have to copy all the key ingredients. What he says is sustainable advantage comes from systems of activities. This is whole system thinking. The systems of activities have to be complementary, and companies with sustainable competitive advantage integrate these activities within their business. So their marketing, service, designs, customer support all fit together very well. They're all consistent, they're interconnected and mutually reinforcing. It's interesting that 30 years ago the subject of HR strategy did not get much of a mention here. But nevertheless, he goes on to say, as a result, competitors don't have to match just one thing, they have to match the whole system. And until rivals achieve the whole system, they don't get very many of the benefits. So in other words, if you have to compete with an organisation like Toyota, you have to copy the whole Toyota system and maybe improve on it. What you can't do is get all of the benefits just by trying to copy the Toyota production system, which is what a lot of organisations have tried to do. It's easy to forget where Toyota has come from and how it's achieved such success. So let's just remind ourselves about some of its relatively recent history. Here's a comment from Koji Endo, an automotive industry analyst, who said, little by little, over the last 30 years, Japanese car makers have been conquering the US market and now account for 28% of the roughly 17 million cars sold each year in the world's biggest market. And that's now the key to their fortunes. Toyota obviously targeted the North American market because it was actually the most lucrative car market. Obviously also very, very competitive, but it offered the most lucrative returns. He goes on to say, the fact is the Japanese are making record high profits out of this 28% of the market share, and the big three are making absolutely no profits from their 60% market share, Endo added. And of course he was referring to General Motors, Ford and Daimler Chrysler. This starts to suggest just how efficient Toyota is as a car manufacturing business and how it can make profit on all its vehicles, whereas its three biggest competitors in America had a huge share of the market and yet couldn't make any profit out of it. There has to be a secret to Toyota's success, and part of that secret is the way it manages its human capital. One piece of evidence that points to Toyota's management of people as enabling them to have a sustainable competitive advantage is the fact that the unit cost of production for an American car was averaging about $3,500 more than for a Japanese one. Now, we have to ask ourselves the question, how can that be? Surely the raw materials and the technology are the same for all car manufacturers. And in fact, if we look at this in detail, we'll find that a high percentage of this extra cost is through pension arrangements and healthcare that the American car manufacturers have to provide for their employees. Now obviously Toyota moving into this market wasn't burdened with this sort of extra cost, but then the American car companies negotiated these benefits for their employees, obviously when times were better. So the question we have to ask is, how far ahead were they thinking when they started to negotiate deals like this with their employees? And how much of it was under pressure from union negotiators rather than from any clear-headed strategic business approach to managing people? Certainly Toyota have a huge competitive advantage if they don't have to have these costs added to every car that they produce. It's no wonder that Toyota's market capitalisation is now bigger than that for GM, Ford and Daimler Chrysler combined. The Toyota production system is famous around the world, and many manufacturers have either tried to copy it or at least replicate certain parts of the Toyota production system. So we're going to go back to the history of the Toyota production system to see really what are the key building blocks of this system. In the book called Toyota 50 Years in Motion, they talk about the roots of the Kanban system, and if you want to read in more detail about the Kanban system you can do. But it says here that back in 1938 Toyota was using a lot production system, which is a bit like a batch production system. But Kiichiro, who's actually regarded as one of the geniuses of the Toyota organisation, his idea was to switch over entirely to a flow type production system. Obviously a smooth flow tends to help produce a much more efficient manufacturing system. He reasoned that this would eliminate large stocks of materials and parts, doing away with the need for warehouses and thereby reducing capital outflow. And Eiji Toyoda says, if we were able to sell our finished product before payments were due on our materials and parts, we would no longer have any need for operating capital. This is a very simple idea. It's very difficult to do in practice, but it's a very simple idea and it makes you superbly efficient, especially as you don't need to have any operating capital. Here we see the first reference to the idea of just-in-time, and Kiichiro the genius referred to this smooth flow as a just-in-time concept. In other words, just make what is needed. He even went so far as to say if you finish early you are free to go home, and if not you put in overtime. They still follow these principles today. Most Toyota factories have to produce a set number of vehicles, and if they don't finish them by the end of the working shift, then they stay until they do finish them. They were bringing in a radically new system, and to get their people to accept it, Toyota says they had to rid them entirely of their notions of the old ways of doing things. So this was really about change management. He even refers to it, he says in a sense it was a brainwashing operation. And he said that marked the beginning of the Toyota production system. Now you might think that brainwashing employees has no part to play in a modern, enlightened human resource management strategy. And obviously brainwashing has all sorts of negative connotations. We probably wouldn't use that word today, but any organisation that really wants to get the best out of its people needs to have a clear vision of what it's trying to achieve, and it really does want to engage people entirely in the process of achieving that vision. Here we start to see discussion of the whole concept of quality control, and as we would probably know it these days, quality assurance. So Toyota talks about the task of the inspection manager. And it wasn't even then, many years ago, just to distinguish between a good and a bad product, but actually to find out what was causing the product to be defective and to actually fix it, whether it's the machinery, the equipment, the tools or whatever. The whole point was to prevent defective products from arising. Now they talk about quality control, but we would now call this quality assurance, because as Toyota says, it's about creating product quality within the process, and is essentially identical to Kiichiro's thinking. He goes on to say this was an idea that would have occurred to anyone because it's such common sense, and Kiichiro was certainly no genius for stumbling upon it, but what set him apart was his initiative in putting the idea into practice. So the ideas themselves are not actually that difficult, they're very simple, they're very much common sense, but putting it into practice is really what matters. There is no chapter in this book entitled the People chapter. So what we have to do is read between the lines, and we have to remind ourselves that this is a book written about what was happening over 70 years ago, back in the late 1930s. And Toyota says that in any decision, the people at the top are just the flag wavers. It won't do to wave your flag and have no one to follow you. This is therefore a comment about leadership. So waving that flag in a way that makes people fall into line behind you is what makes a decision a good one. That people actually want to do what you need them to do for the organisation. And Kiyachiro was determined to use this new production system, but at the time it was all in his head. Unless he got everyone to close ranks and march in step behind him, he didn't have the slightest hope for success. Now, it's very interesting. This could almost appear to be a military operation. But as we already know, HR strategy is very much in tune with military strategy. Anyone looking at Toyota today might jump to the conclusion that they've always had easy employee relations. But actually they had a very bad strike in the early 1950s, and these were some of the lessons that they learned from that strike. Toyota starts by saying mutual trust is the basis of labour relations, not one side putting the other side under duress. Labour relations at Toyota were initially marked by doubts and disbelief. There wasn't much trust there, but with time differences were ironed out. Eventually there was a labour management declaration that they signed, which was simply a written statement of a rapprochement. And the purpose of this document was to uphold and sustain the trust that had been built up. Trust is everything in employee relations. And also they were worried about backsliding, so they tried to prevent backsliding by either side from this position. People can move over time, and they may go back on some of the agreements they made in the past or renege on them. It also was intended as a reminder to those who came after to guard the fruits won through the sacrifices made by both sides. And it took about 10 years for that relationship of mutual trust to take hold. And the spirit of this declaration still lives on at Toyota today. I guess that is always under pressure, that relationship, because once you've shattered trust, it's going to take many years to build it up again. Now, how many other automotive companies would set out on a strategic course of building up this level of trust and actually build it into their plans that it might take about 10 years, when maybe they're often being run according to very short-term objectives? Somebody who has written a great deal about the Toyota way is Jeffrey Leica, an American academic and actually an industrial engineer. So Leica looks at Toyota very much from the Toyota production system angle and, if you like, the mechanics of the way they produce cars. But he also sees how the views of the organisation about managing people are totally entwined, totally integrated with their engineering ability, if we can put it that way. And in his book, The Toyota Way, he talks about the 14 management principles. Toyota is very much a business built on solid principles. So let's have a look at the list that Leica particularly picks on. One of them is the basic idea of a long-term philosophy. Toyota really thinks long-term. In effect, they're almost fighting a war with their competitors, and so they take this very long-term strategic view. From a mechanical, if you like, production point of view, one of the principles is they need a continuous process flow, a smooth operation to be as efficient as possible. They have the Kanban system, which is basically a pull system. You only ask for parts when you need them. And they also try and level out workload, so that, again, it's a very smooth, continuous process. Now we start talking about the culture, and there is a culture of stop to fix. You can stop the production line if you think something is going wrong. A lot of organisations would not allow an employee to do this. They would only accept that from maybe a senior manager who would have the responsibility for actually stopping the production line. But this is a culture. It's not just a process of stopping the production line. It's an acceptance that this is a good thing to do. Obviously, standardisation is key, particularly in a mass production environment. And standardising everything, timing everything, measuring everything to a standard is key to the production process at Toyota. They like to use visual controls. Pictures paint 1,000 words, and this is what wins people over to actually want to do something about a problem. If they can see a picture that says this needs to be sorted out, they like to use visual controls. They like to use reliable technology. They won't take a chance on something until it is well tried and tested. And even today, Toyota will use manual systems if they think they're better than any other, say, computer-based technology. They tend to grow their own leaders who actually live the philosophy. Obviously, as the organisation gets older and older, this is more difficult to do. You know, who is going to lead Toyota in the coming years? So they tend to grow people from within who know what the philosophy is and actually live and breathe it. They try and develop exceptional people, and if you read any of the books, including Leica's, he will tell you about some of the exceptional people at Toyota, including the person who was given the job of producing the Lexus range from scratch and actually based it on Mercedes and BMW and Volvo, but almost a genius of an engineer who started a whole new brand from nothing, from a blank sheet of paper. They have respect not only for their own employees but their network of partners, and this respect is absolutely crucial to the supply chain, that sort of relationship that they need to run an efficient operation. They also expect their managers to go and see problems for themselves. They call it Genchi Genbutsu. And again, there are stories in Leica's book where senior managers expect other managers to go and see what is causing the problem. You can't sit in your ivory tower in Toyota and expect to sort problems out. You're expected to go and see them. They like to take time when they're deciding. They might take years to make a decision on something like the Prius. But once they've decided, then they put it into operation very quickly. They implement as rapidly as they can, because they don't want to lose any competitive advantage in that time. But they plan and they plan and they plan. They decide very slowly. Leica talks about them becoming a learning organisation. I'm not sure if this is a phrase that the people at Toyota would use themselves, but it's pretty clear that if you want to get an example of a learning organisation, Toyota is probably the best one around. It's probably not inaccurate to say that some of the biggest, most ambitious and most successful organisations in the world are run by people who are actually obsessed with becoming the biggest and the best. And this is certainly true of Toyota. Toyota refers back to a time back in 1962 when they were worried about being overtaken, and they rapidly started putting up one factory after another. Again, this sounds like a sort of military domination operation, and that's not too far from the truth. And if we go to a more recent quote, we have this comment. "I have the impression that Toyota became a big company in a very short time," Watanabe said, who was the third successive president to hail from outside the Toyota clan. He told a news conference. And then he says, "Are we becoming too complacent? This is something I fear and feel we need to address." Now, at the time that this recording is being made, in 2010, Toyota has just had 2 big recalls of huge numbers of vehicles. And maybe Toyota is asking itself, have we grown too quickly? Have we lost sight of some of our original objectives? Who knows what the future holds for Toyota? But my guess is if they stick to their principles, which served them very well for 70 years, they'll come through this and they'll continue to probably be the best automotive company in the world.